my mind. I gave the keynote speech at one of the first Trans Day of Remembrance events here in Portland. This event is held each year in remembrance of those trans people who've been killed because of their trans identity. The idea behind the Trans Day of Visibility is to create a day in celebration of trans identity, to proclaim our presence, to create a day in celebration of trans identity, to proclaim our presence in a positive light. At the time I transitioned, trans people weren't on the cultural radar at all, and invisible people. There was some safety in this invisibility, but it also meant there was no mainstream recognition of trans identity, no public sector support or services available. Now, we're more visible than ever before, and with this visibility has come increased risk for our safety. Trans Day of Vigilance is my lived experience every day, open as I am about being a trans man. Yes, we have more services available to us, and here we are speaking to the City Council. And I'm well aware that if I were at City Hall right now speaking before you, I would indeed be vigilant when I left the building, having just come out to a large number of people I don't know. Visible, yes, but with a feeling of being in the limelight and the crosshairs at the same time. Reading stories every day about anti-trans bathroom bills, about the state of Arkansas passing legislation the day before yesterday to outlaw medical care in service of transition. In light of such vicious responses to our identity, we need to know that the place we call home is indeed welcoming and supportive of us as we emerge into the light of day. This is such a polarized time in our culture, much more so than I've ever seen in my 65 years on the planet. This is a time for allies to step up overtly in support of those of us in the crosshairs, letting us know we're not alone in the limelight. What does it look like to be an ally? Putting your pronouns in your email address after your Zoom name on your name tag, putting some effort into learning more about what it means to transition, what it means to be non-binary. There's a lot of helpful information to be had from the internet. If you find out a friend, a neighbor's child is transitioning, go to them and say, congratulations, how can I support you? Work towards social justice side by side with us. My perspective is that of the therapist, focused on interpersonal relationship. Others will be speaking from the perspective of policy and support services. Support from every perspective will help us as we venture out of marginalization and invisibility and into the arena of full participation as our true selves. Thank you.
Seth, I believe you're next.
Hello, everybody. My name is Seth Johnstone, and this is Heaven King, and we're coming to you from SMRC. We did a writing workshop the other day, and we asked folks what visibility meant to them. And so these are words from SMRC youth that I'll share, and then I'll turn it over to Heaven. I asked youth, what does visibility mean to you? And folks said, visibility means wanting to express yourself and not be afraid or nervous or in danger. I asked them, have you ever felt invisible? And folks said, people listening to our wants and needs and not invalidating us based on our ideas is really important. People have been raised to discriminate against us who are different from them. We need better LGBTQ specific shelters. If we're without housing, it is even harder to be there when people treat us poorly. I asked them, what do you want community you live in to know about you or see? And folks said, I want them to know that systems aren't built for everyone the same way and inclusion needs to happen. These are words from our youth who are 13 to 23, who wanted to remain anonymous. I asked, what injustices do trans and gender nonconforming people face? And our youth said, the lack of access to employment, education, and being pushed out of our housing spaces, bullying for looking different from the expected gender binary, being killed for what we identify as. I asked them, what issues do you care about? And folks said, our community face a lot of hate crimes, and we have a lack of medical support. And again, we need a specific shelter that is just specifically for LGBTQ youth. I asked folks to write poems about what they were passionate about and about their identities. And this is a poem from Cyrus. Cyrus said, I should have known sooner, always hating my name and wanting to wear boys' clothes, detached in my body and lost, stuck, not knowing what's going on. You were scared as much as I was. It was new to both of us. I learned and moved forward as you stayed in the past. I asked our youth, what do you want your community leaders to see? And folks said, visibility means being out on our own terms, not having to answer invasive, dehumanizing questions. We may have anti-discrimination laws that give some people resources to address injustice, but this will often not be for the people who need the most protection, since those folks who need it most often have the least access to necessary resources to assert their rights. Trans Day of Visibility is important because we need to start addressing the underlying attitudes that cause discrimination in the first place. We just want to be seen so folks understand us. And last but not least, there was a really great quote that they wanted to share, which is, I want them to see the good side of our community, that we mean peace when we rally, that we will fight for our happiness. And I'll turn it over to Heaven King to share a piece that they wrote.
My name is Heaven King. I am 18 years old. I attend SMRC and I am also non-binary, which means that I have never felt comfortable with gender or any of the gender normalities. That's why I want Portland City Council to find more places that support trans people like me so that we can feel like we belong in our city. Isn't that what it means to be one with your neighborhood, is to feel like you belong? That's all I have. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, y'all. From SMRC to you, we appreciate you for having us here.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Reed. Thank you all. Council, we have a little bit of time if you'd like to ask any questions. Otherwise, we can move on to our next performance. And you can also think about it and then ask at the end if they stay on with us. Commissioner Hardesty?
Thank you so much. What powerful words today. I'm almost speechless, but not quite. I wanted to ask Seth, the young man that's with you, the young person that's with you. I'd like to know, tell me a time in Portland where you felt totally safe.
What do you mean exactly? Like, can you word it differently, please?
Well, you said that you want to feel safe,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so I want you to give me a example of a time where you felt safe.
Well, I usually feel safer in my neighborhoods because most of the time when I like going places, I usually have to take TriMet there because I can't drive because I am physically disabled. Well, one time I was trying to get on the max and this guy said he wanted me to cut you, pull out a knife on you because I was dressed more femininely. And I don't like stuff happening like that to other people of my age.
Right. And that shouldn't happen to anybody.
Exactly.
Right. You should be able to travel wherever you want to go without interference.
Yes.
Right. Thank you. You just said I want to feel safe. So I just wanted to get an example of that. Thank you very much. I appreciate your statement.
Mayor Wheeler, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Seraphy. So I had a general question, and I'm not sure if this is directed towards anyone individually. It's more of a general question. Hearing some of the history and the injustices, particularly around access to housing and to healthcare, that sort of raised an issue to me that's very germane to today, which is access to support around healthcare and mental health services as a result of the COVID pandemic. We are seeing obvious health impacts from the COVID pandemic, but as we heard during this morning's council session, there are also obvious increases in mental health needs being brought about by social isolation. People aren't able to congregate and do group types of activities the way they were able to previously. People who are very athletic and engaged in sporting teams and things like that don't necessarily have access to those opportunities. Educational opportunities have moved either to non-existent or virtual. And so there's been a lot of talk about not only the health impacts, but the mental health impacts of COVID to the population at large. There's been discussion at City Council about disproportionate impacts on our communities of color, but I haven't heard as much about the impact on the trans community. And I'm wondering if anybody has any insight into that or has any thoughts or experiences that you'd be willing to share with our City Council. And again, just generally, I want to thank everybody for sharing their lived experience with us today. It's very important that we hear it. And I understand for some it can be re-traumatizing. And so I want to make sure that this is valuable for you too. But I'm really interested on this question of COVID health and mental health and what we need to know about the trans community as we allocate resources that we'll get from the American Recovery Act into the community.
Mayor, I want to give our performers and speakers a chance to address that. And I think also we might be having some other speakers that address that later coming up. And
yeah, that'd be terrific.
Kind of eyeing Cass right now. So I want to say that. Yeah, Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you. Would you also add housing? Because I believe the CP3 camps were the first time that we've actually created something that was specific for transgender community members. So it's important to really think about what the wraparound supports needs are as well.
Absolutely. And we will have a speaker speaking directly to that in a little bit too. So I might, unless there's any Reed or Zelos or Seth, if you wanted to speak directly to the mayor's question, or we can move on to the later speakers.
Sarah, if it's part of somebody's presentation, then I can certainly wait. And if we still have questions afterwards, I can ask them.
It's a very broad question, Mayor. If you don't mind me jumping in briefly, I'll try to be as brief as possible. And I'm very grateful someone else is taking up the torch for a longer presentation on this today. I can only speak from my perspective and the perspectives that I've shared when talking with Aaron and Babatunde and other people in the trans community. So I think you could just basically take whatever has already been impacting us and multiply that by 5 or 10. I think in the last year and a half, due to the unseen, I'm going to call them unseen consequences of COVID, I've probably had about 5 people in my circle commit suicide, to speak frankly, because they don't have access to our queer spaces. Right now, it's been incredibly dire. We've already lost lots of venues. They weren't just restaurants. To a lot of us, they were the only places we could go to be free outside of our homes. So I think what already affects human beings, we're social creatures, is affecting our community in a much greater way, because we're not just going out for a drink or a coffee or a tea. We are seeing our family, we're seeing our siblings. So that affects mental health, which dovetails with, I'm sure, all the presentations you've heard on mental health services and what we need as far as that. Housing, incredibly critical right now, very, very critical. We didn't really have stable housing to begin with, despite a lot of equity and equality laws being passed. So that is really paramount. And then allocating funds directly, I think you're moving in a very beautiful, perfect direction. We know what's best for our community. We're not unfocused or inept. As you can see, we are totally fly. We do totally dope fire things. And we're doing our best to do those things as hard as we can without passing out at the end of the day and speaking to lots of different people. But I would say that's the most pressing concern is making sure that our homes are stable and our families are stable. So I spoke earlier in my presentation about DHS, which is just one little window into how we get brushed aside or treated like we're dangerous just because we're a little different, but we're really not that different. So I don't know if that answers your question briefly, but all those things times 10.
Yeah, that was actually extremely illustrative, and I appreciate it. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. And thank you to our speakers and before. And now I'd like to ask OpenSignal to play the video presentation that we have, which is a performance. Anyone from OpenSignal on?
Megan, is there something you need to do, like screen share or something with OpenSignal to get the video up?
Yeah, let me look into that quickly.
It always works that way, though, doesn't it?
Why don't we, would it be helpful if we move on to the next speaker for time, and then we can play the video after that? Okay. So while they work on getting the video, I'll just say a bit about Atlas. Atlas Marshall is a trans femme performance artist and was a contestant on American Idol and placed in the top 24 of season 8. Since then, she has gone on to produce some of the most successful drag shows in the city, as well as being the host of the Portland Drag Queen Brunch pre-COVID. She wants all of you to celebrate the trans people in your lives and be as vigilant as possible for trans people who can no longer be visible due to violence or death. And I have watched this already and it made me cry, so just be prepared. Thank you.
I went up to the mountain because you asked me to, up over the clouds to where the sky was blue. I could see all around me. Sometimes I feel like I'm never nothing but tired, and I'll be working till the day I expire. See, sometimes I lay down. No more can I do. And then I go on again. Because you asked me to. Some days I look down, afraid I would fall. And although the sun shines, I see nothing at all. Then I hear your sweet, sweet voice say, come and go. Telling me softly that you love me so.
With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Babatunde. Babatunde is a Black, Indigenous, queer, Two-Spirit, disabled Southern femme in Portland by the ways of Athens, Georgia. And Babatunde is the director of Black Beyond the Binary Collective. And we want to thank you for joining us today. And you are up next.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Before we get started, I did want to use some of my time just to do a land and labor acknowledgement since that didn't happen earlier. So we do our work on the stolen land of the Kalapuya, the Wasco, the Cowlitz, Multnomah, Tualatin, Clackamas, Kaflamet, Malolo, middle bands of Chinook, and many other tribes that made their home along the Columbia River. We live in a nation of wealth created by the subjugation and exploitation of African people brought to Turtle Island through chattel slavery, or the Mafa, which is Swahili for the Great Disaster. We uplift our original Native American stewards of our land and the forced contributions of generations of Africans. We ground our fight knowing that there is no Black liberation without Indigenous sovereignty and no Indigenous sovereignty without Black liberation. We fight for land back and reparations and refute settler colonialism, anti-Black racism, and imperialism. Wado. OCO Mayor, OCO Commissioners, as folks mentioned, my name is Babatunde. My pronouns are they, them. I'm Executive Director of Black and Beyond the Binary Collective. Our mission at Black and Beyond the Binary Collective is dedicated to the healing, liberation, and safety of Black, African, transgender, non-binary, and intersex Oregonians. Thank you all so much for having me. I did wanted to share just a little bit about some of where our work has been grounded in the past, and where we're kind of shifting with everything that's going on with COVID and meeting the needs of our community. So previously, our work has definitely been focused on leadership development for young Black Oregonians, specifically folks who have been pushed to East County in Portland, Oregon. It's a paid leadership development program for youth LGBT who are 14 to 26. That program has been going since 2017, as well as doing the Night Out for Safety and Liberation, which is essentially an event to change the conversation around public safety to be less focused on fear, punishment, and criminalization. One of the other programs that we typically have done is the Trans Diaspora of Resilience. We do this work after all of the brilliant work that's happened from queer agitational organizers that came before us. Particularly just want to shout out Layla, because without the work that Layla had done for Sankofa Collective and Black PFLAG, we would not be here with Black and Beyond the Binary Collective, so I definitely want to shout that out. But the Trans Diaspora of Resilience is just uniting all folks of color who are Black, Indigenous, POC, who are a part of the trans community. Particularly for us as Black people, as Native folks and folks of color, the visibility piece feels a bit hard, just because for us, not necessarily, we all don't want to be seen. A lot of us actually just want to live our lives in safety and peace and live to a ripe old age, like many other communities. The reality is that 1 in 5 trans people in the United States have been discriminated against when trying to find housing. And that is definitely a reality that I've heard echoed throughout many different instances and cases with people that we work with in our community. 1 in 5 transgender individuals have experienced homelessness at some point in their lives. As somebody who was kicked out of the home at 14 and was homeless for a lot of my teen years into my early, adulthood, I definitely relate to that. Just trying to be yourself definitely does result often in loss of housing, loss of medical care, loss of income, which creates more increased risk to engage with the carceral state or the police, right? When we have to do other things so that we can survive. I think it's estimated that about 20 to 40% of more than 1.6 million homeless youth are LGBTQ identified, which is a pretty significant number and definitely tells the story of exactly what's happening in the homes when these young folks come out and are experiencing issues with their parents and really don't have community support. with everything that I've just mentioned and everything that's going on with the pandemic, our work has had to shift from being primarily focused on social engagement for our communities to meet the needs in terms of service delivery. We partnered with Multnomah County to distribute over $75,000 worth of resources into the trans community, particularly the Black trans community. I can't tell you how quickly that money went. We made an announcement and the money was gone in an hour. So that should tell you how high the need is in our community, especially when we don't create additional barriers for people to access the resources. With that being said, I'm glad that this conversation around housing is happening, specifically because I wanted to introduce our newest staff on Black and Beyond the Binary Collective. This is Jerome, who is the Deputy Director. Do you have anything you want to say, Jerome, to introduce yourself? Your pronouns.
My pronouns are they and Z. Use a 60-40 split. That's really appreciated. Black, non-binary. Happy to be here for now. I also just wanted to add that T-Dub is particularly hard for Black folks because it's a day of visibility, and visibility doesn't ultimately equal like being heard, being seen, being valued. And so really to bring in the message as we go on throughout today, and we revisit this event every year, to really like look at that as an option to really not just be visible, but to really make sure that people's needs are being met.
Yeah, and so I think with that, we definitely were shifting to a point to realize that people were reaching out for resources like cash assistance, which also led to people asking about, can I get support with my rent? Can you help me move? You know, who do I turn to if I need to talk to somebody who is trans and knows the experience and I'm like in a crisis moment? And so with that, we have partnered with the Joint Office of Homeless Services, as well as Join, to join their In-Reach program to create a housing fund specifically for Black trans people in Portland and Multnomah County so that they can get the support that they need right now. Everybody on our team, all 5 of our small, tiny staff, every single one of us has been dealing with issues of like increased violence as well as housing insecurity. So this is an issue that's very near and dear to our hearts. And actually, Jerome can say more about the program, so I'm gonna hand it off to them.
Hey folks, so the TT Gully Housing project that we're starting is basically aimed at making sure that folks can be completely housed and whole. And we realize in our community, if you are not housed, you don't feel a part of the community, you don't feel a part of yourself. And so our goal is to make sure that we can increase the access to the funding so folks can be properly housed, right? We're not talking about putting folks in a motel room for 2 days. We actually want someone to be able to sign a lease and move into a house where they can then focus on being themselves and live their lives. This access is super important, and it's really engaging work because we really want to make sure that folks are properly housed in a way that is effective and feels really, really good, right? And so part of this work is really going to reach all the barriers that housing presents, right? Some folks may find an apartment, but then they can't pay for it. And so what we're going to be able to do is to make sure that they can get the access to get the funds to pay for this apartment, as well as just like all the other needs that they have. Moving costs are super expensive. I literally just relocated from New York City to Portland. And so that cross-country move is expensive. So I can't even imagine what it's like for folks here moving from county to county without the proper resources. And so what we want to make sure to do is that the access is there so that they can just say, hey, I just need a couple of $100s to pay this mover to get here. I don't have it right now. I'm going to lose my apartment. And so what we want to do is to be able to fill those gaps so that folks can get that access and be properly housed. Another part of that is going to lead into a lot of our wraparound services. And so this housing fund and this housing program will also help folks to say, okay, now that I've focused on my housing, maybe I want to talk to a therapist. And so some of the work that we're going to be doing is to make sure that as we are building the wraparound services for support, there are other avenues for folks to engage in so that the support is always there and they can engage at a time that feels good for them. We really ask that the city pays attention to these needs. Someone said this earlier, like, we know what to do in our community. You just have to make sure that the access to the funding and the things that we need is there. We don't need you to tell us how to do it. We just want you to make sure that the access is there and work with us on how to provide that. The other piece to that is, we also don't want to be tokenized. And so if you reach out to us to build that relationship with us, you have to allow us the time to trust y'all to build that relationship. And so it may feel wonky. You may hear things that you don't like. And we're going to ask you to sit with that for a second so that we can come back and engage in a conversation that feels great and it doesn't feel strange. Back to you, Mayor.
Yeah, and I think before we close out, I would just lift up like something that Zello said about all of the suicide that's happening right now. Housing is suicide prevention. You know, that I wonder, we've experienced so much death in the Black trans community, just in the Black community in general. And I wonder how many of those instances of those Black trans women or Black trans folks that have been murdered could have been avoided had they had a place to lay their head that was safe. So I'll let that sink in, that part. Wado, Ski, thank y'all.
Thank you. I now want to turn it over to Cass. And sorry, Cass, I got lost in my doc here for how to introduce. All right, Cass Averall is the founder and board president of Transponder, a support, resource, and educational organization for and about transgender and gender diverse communities in Eugene, Oregon. We're lucky to have him joining us today, and we thought it would be nice to also include things that weren't just in Portland. So their organization strives to increase transgender support and awareness through relationship building and education. Transponder is committed to addressing community needs and deconstructing the root causes of discrimination, both locally and at the state level with an intersectional social justice lens. So with that, I'm excited to introduce Cass, and we're getting a little short on time, but I hope we might have some time for some engagement at the end with Babatunde and what Cass will say.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, and I'll try to get through my information as quick as possible.
That's more for the commissioner's knowledge.
Well, I'm a talker, so it also applies to me. Transponder's been around for 8 years. We've been doing this work providing direct services and support to the trans and gender diverse community. I have sort of lovingly called ourselves the firefighters for the community because it's more about what are your needs? All right, that's how we need to activate and help. So we do a little bit of everything depending on what the community is bringing forward. In regards to why I was asked to talk today, I want to actually address the mayor's question first because it leads right into the rest of the information that I have, which was around what's the effect of COVID on our population. And let me just tell you, Transponder sent out a community-wide survey at the very early stages, about a year ago, when COVID hit, to ask the community, what's going on for you? Where are your shifts of focus? What do you need? And what we found is the top concerns that the community came out and said they need is they are saying they need access to mental and medical care, like appropriate and knowledgeable care. And then the second thing was social support, access to social support. With the quarantining and the isolation, we're already dealing with a hugely isolated community. We already had isolation issues before COVID. COVID has made it exponentially worse, which is having major effects on people's mental and emotional health, which means when we're talking about, how that plays out, we're seeing higher rates of suicide, higher rates of homelessness, higher rates of, personal and domestic violence throughout the community. The hate and the violence that society at large has felt, the floodgates have opened. The community has been attacked greatly since COVID, and the access to care, support, and services has been locked down. People who had surgeries on the books before COVID hit had their surgeries indefinitely postponed or flat out canceled. So people who were at the point of finally getting access to these things, the rug was ripped out right from under them. And that alone caused a lot of suicidal ideation in the community. It's a big deal. Plus, we're seeing OHP is getting inundated with everybody wanting to sign up, but they did not increase their capacity across the board, number one. And then number two, they certainly did not increase their capacity of doctors or providers who are knowledgeable about how to care for the transgender population. So if you happen to be on OHP, it's actually way harder now because everybody else is also accessing the same doctors. So this is an issue. It's something that's come up. Well, we've seen higher rates in homelessness, higher rates in violence and discrimination, and higher rates in suicide since COVID. So those are the big things that I wanted to point out. But I was asked here to talk about, kind of like provide you with some information about what being transgender and homeless looks like outside of the Portland metro area, and what we're seeing. And so if I dive into that, what we see is like the trans homeless population is just at a greater risk of exposure and infection when we're talking about COVID. And here in Eugene, with the city has been sweeping homeless camps and preventing them from sheltering in place, which is another item that increases their risk and exposure to spreading this virus. I will say that, and then also point out it's important to note that the city of Eugene has actually funneled all unhoused people into 2 homeless camps. Between those 2 homeless camps, they will occupy about 300 people total. That's between both of them. Our homeless population in Eugene is over 13 times that size. So that's an issue. So all the camps are at full capacity. If they get any bigger, people cannot appropriately socially distance. So there's no way to increase the sizes of those camps. When you look at that, you can see these are general population camps. These are not camps particularly focused on certain populations other than unhoused. So when you start compounding intersectional, identities of marginalization, then we start seeing these issues rise exponentially as well. Now, also for those who are housed, we're seeing many are now forced to quarantine and go into isolation with unsupported family members or housemates, meaning they're forced into these unsafe situations, forced into the closet. And all of these things, again, like I mentioned before, have great effects on people's mental and emotional health. Just to consider, transgender people were already 4 times as likely than the general population to have suicidal thoughts or ideation. And now that's even more so through the roof. And that was just for the general population. Again, you start compounding these identities of marginalization and those numbers just get worse and worse. But what I did in preparation for our call today is I reached out to Eugene's frontline workers to find out what they were seeing. They're the ones out there actually providing the support. So I talked to Black Thistle Street Aid, Occupy Medical, Core Eugene, HIV Alliance, Whitebird, Cahoots, to get their perspective of what's going on. And so this is what they're seeing. They are seeing extremely higher rates of homelessness with trans and queer youth. The amount of trans and queer youth that are ending up on the streets is markedly different than before COVID. We're seeing a lot of youth fleeing unsafe situations. Many are staying in the closet as long as they possibly can, even in unsafe situations, trying to prevent becoming homeless. We're also seeing an increase in youth being trafficked because of lack of support networks. Safe housing support for queer and trans youth is already really hard in Oregon. And we're finding that because of this, a lot of our frontline workers are having to actually refer people out of state to get access to safe housing that actually acknowledges their gender identity and sexuality. This is a problem that needs to be addressed. Trans people are forced into a state of homelessness because of social unacceptance. Then they're also being harassed and persistently displaced and moved. And then on top of all of that, they're dealing with transphobia and homophobia. So this results in higher levels of stress, severe PTSD. We're seeing trauma triggers and responses exponentially heightened, and an overall acute and worsening state of depression and anxiety in the community. All homeless trans people that these organizations have worked with, all of them, every single one of them reported that they experience microaggressions and hate from other homeless folks that they are forced to camp with. So, and when these folks are experiencing this kind of hate and violence, what results is we see them not engaging with services. They do not come to clinics. They do not even approach clinic or service providers when they're in their camps. They rarely engage us at all unless we approach them. And the reasoning behind that is because they do not believe that there are any services that are actually for them. They do not believe that any services were created with them in mind. And so they don't think that anything that is potentially out there actually applies. This is, again, a big problem. But what do we know? Right? What do we know about our populations? What we know is on average that homeless people die 30 years earlier than the rest of the population. This is a harrowing statistic that is even more severe for those who have marginalized identities, such as those are homeless and transgender, or homeless, transgender, and disabled, or homeless, transgender, disabled, and a person of color. You can see how these things just start compounding. It's not one is worse than the other, it's they all add on top of each other. And so when we're not looking at an entire community, we're not looking at the nuances of that community or even the most marginalized inside that community either. And that is something that I think we could all do better on. And then we need to decriminalize homelessness and stop punishing people for not having housing. Transgender people are ending up in unhoused situations not by choice most of the time. So we got to stop punishing people for their circumstances. Currently, there is House Bill 3115 on the books that is attempting to address this and needs our support. Additionally, the criminalization of homelessness on top of transphobia and homophobia is causing a disproportionate negative effect on the LGBTQ+ population at large, a population that already faces lack of institutional awareness, understanding, and support. As a community, we must learn how to better protect the most marginalized among us. And that is the bulk of the information I had today. I hope that is helpful to give you a little bit of an idea of what is existing outside of Portland, but much of the information I provided is just kind of generally about the population at large, not necessarily specific to Eugene.
Thank you, Cass. That was incredibly informative and helpful. I now need to turn it over to Layla, who's going to share the kind of ask that the community panel that worked together came up with. So Layla, turning it over to you.
Thank you. And I want to say thank you to everyone who's spoken so far today, especially to Babatunde and Black and Beyond the Binary. I don't think we had quite enough time to truly absorb everything that they gave us. So if y'all have time to review that, please do. Thank you for taking the time to recognize and appreciate the trans community as a vital part of shared cultural, economic, and moral contributions to humanity. Because we know that systems and institutions which oppress us are upheld by individuals, this year, we invite you to deviate from the usual practice of policy-based change, and instead, we're asking that folks lead by example through engaging the individual in interpersonal learning that is necessary to affect lifelong allyship, not only to the trans community, but to the multitudes of experiences and communities that we are all a part of. We believe that council should model the personal investment necessary for true equity through actions like engaging with this list of meaningful and educational resources that we are providing you in your office. We can drastically shift the understanding around the root causes of oppression and have everlasting effects on how you approach all of your efforts for equality for the rest of your lives, not just for the time that you're in office. So we will be providing y'all with a list of resources and continued learning that will include titles like The Invention of Women, Making African Sense of Western Gender Discourse, the documentary Disclosure, Brainstorm, The Flaws in the Science of Sex Differences, books like Skin, Tooth, and Bone, The Basis of Movement is Our People, and The Revolution Starts at Home. The list is much longer, but y'all will be provided with that at a further date. And I really encourage y'all to both engage with that individually and with each other, like keep each other accountable for this learning as you move forward. Thank you again for your time, and I will turn it back over to Seraphy.
Thank you, Layla. As we draw this event to a close, I want to quickly thank all of the performers and speakers today for taking time out of their very busy schedules to share their lives and expertise with us. As the mayor said earlier, this can be especially, re-traumatizing. And so we are lucky and, deserve to be giving people compensation for that time and effort. And with that, I also want to thank the community members that worked with our office to create the run of show for today. And I also want to thank Matthew and Aja from the mayor's team who have supported the logistics from behind the scenes and me generally as a human. And then finally, I want to thank City Council and all the people that tuned into today's event to honor Transgender Day of Visibility. I hope that we can honor the request for action as government that we've heard from our community members today. And on a personal note, I want to leave us with a quote from Coach Carter, which I watched for the 50th time the other night. Big basketball fan and played for my whole life, but it's our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. You playing small does not serve the world. We are meant to shine as children do. It's not just in some of us, it is in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. This has been true for me, participating in Transgender Day of Visibility every year. And as I've gotten to spend more time with trans folks who are not afraid to be who they are, I feel more comfortable being in my own non-binary body. And I hope that today's event, as people watch it in the future, allows more trans and non-binary people to feel comfortable being visible and seen and being who they are. So with that, I will turn that back over to the mayor to read the proclamation.
Thank you, Seraphy, and Layla and Aaron for being our amazing MCs. Thank you to everybody who testified today. This was really fantastic. I think with each one of these Transgender Day of Visibility celebrations we do, the testimony is becoming richer and deeper, and I greatly appreciate it. In a moment, I'm going to give my colleagues a little bit of space to react to what they've heard as well. But before I do that, I want to thank our community leaders and our community organizations who worked collaboratively to put this event together today. That's Basic Rights Oregon, Cascade AIDS Project, GLAPN, Outside the Frame, Sage Metro Portland, SMERC, Q Center, the LGBTQ and Friends Affinity Group, and a dozen employees from bureaus across the entire city, as well as members of my own staff. Matthew Palmer, the LGBTQ plus community outreach intern in my office, Aja Blair, who has the hardest job in city government, which is being my scheduler, and of course, the amazing Seraphy Allen. At this point, before I read the proclamation, I'd like to open this up for my colleagues. I see they all have their hands up. I'll just go in the order in which they raised their hands. Commissioner Hardesty, why don't you start off, please?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you to everybody who shared with us today some really painful truths about life in Portland, Oregon, and honestly, the world that we live in. I will say the things that I know the city can do is certainly around housing because of the significant dollars we put into the joint office. But many of the support services will either come through the Metro grant or they will come through Multnomah County because the city is just not what we fund. Traditionally, we've done a lot more direct service because of the pandemic in response to it. But it is, it's the separation of governments, right? City does this, the county does that, the state does something else. And so I didn't want people to leave today without acknowledging that you have really specific asks on the table. And you may know that the city has just started our budget process, and it's really important that the trans community is engaged in those conversations because if you're not there, we're not having the conversation about all the needs of our community. So I think there are many opportunities to engage coming up very soon. I also want to acknowledge the safety factor of just showing up in this little box today on Zoom. I understand that you put yourself at personal risk speaking truth to who you are and your community needs. And I just wanted you to know that I see that. I see the courage that it takes to speak your truth today. And I just want to thank you for being here. This is also my third year and participating in this day of acknowledgement. But we also know that transgender people, especially Black transgender women, are the most vulnerable people on the planet. And we've seen their deaths and their torture and what happens at the hands of both community members and law enforcement. And we have to not be silent about that epidemic as well. We have a lot of work to do as a city, but I'm confident in my colleagues that collectively we will do our part here at the city. But we can also help you do the advocacy at the county and at the state and at the federal level, because again, we got a lot of work to do and not a lot of time to get it done in. But I'm confident that we collectively can build a much more equitable city coming out of this pandemic. So thank you for being here. I greatly appreciate it.
Commissioner Rubio.
Thank you so much, Mayor Wheeler, for bringing this proclamation to council. And thank you, Seraphy and Aaron, for this very informative program. And to all of the guests and all the performers for sharing your lived experience with us. I'd also like to especially appreciate the BIPOC trans folks and the distinct visibility challenges that they face. I also want to recognize your presence and willingness in telling your stories, and that it can involve re-experiencing moments of trauma, and your willingness to go through that to help non-trans people move out of their own ignorance and grow in their understanding. And that speaks volumes. As someone who's learning and has a lot more to learn, I greatly appreciate the directness and frankness with which you talked today about what it looks like to truly be an ally and how not to tokenize with superficial gestures. I think that's important for me personally to hear, and also for the public to understand as well. And as someone who has a lot to learn, I want you to know that I see you and I stand with you, and I commit to listen and learning how to be authentically and consistently an ally every day. And I'm also very committed to listening and understanding more about the concrete ways that we can be in support. Both using the platform of our offices, but also from what I've heard you mention interpersonally, and in order to move us in the direction that we do need to go. And I also want to say I heard several concrete issues that you cared about, so many, but just a few of them: housing and houselessness, safety, mental health, trauma, healthcare, trans-specific services, economic supports during COVID, and so many others. I have a lot of notes. The city, and more specifically us as elected leaders, also have a role and responsibility to call out and addressing transphobia, homophobia, also xenophobia, anti-Blackness, and other violent negativity, because we all know that these things share the same ugly roots of white supremacy, of colonialism, and patriarchy. So I agree with the comments of a couple of our presenters as well, that we need to use our offices, not just to dismantle these things, but also to instead create the environment we want, where there's strength and joy and love that comes from this community, that translates into positive experiences and enables us to bring our full selves to work and community life in Portland. So I know you're probably exhausted from constantly having to teach people all the time, but I do want to thank you for this important presentation, and I look forward to working on how we can better reflect the totality of lived experiences in Portland.
Thank you, Commissioner Rubio. Commissioner Mapps.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Like all of my colleagues, I want to express my deep appreciation for the powerful presentation that community members shared with us today. And I'm delighted to join with you all today to declare March 31st, 2021 to be Transgender Day of Visibility. This is an important day to me. I think of human history as being the story of an unsteady march towards a better world, a world where human beings are more free, and most in particular, free to be themselves. And Transgender Day of Visibility is an important part of that story. Today, we gather together to remember the struggle that brought our community closer to fuller equality for our transgendered friends and neighbors. And we recognize the work that still needs to be done. As is my wont in preparation for today's event, I did a little bit of research to look into the history of transgendered Portlanders here in Oregon. And of course, that history goes back to time immemorial. The first evidence, at least in the written record that I could find, of transgendered folks here in Oregon stretches back to the early 1800s. And then closer to my lifetime, by the time we got to the early 1960s, the historical record shows that there were vibrant, active, and connected transgender communities right here in Portland. I remember the 1980s and 1990s when we began to see groups like Northwest Gender Alliance and Phoenix Rising, which emerged and began to serve Portland's transgender community. And it's a delight to see so many new organizations which have taken up this important work. I've already mentioned the Northwest Gender Alliance, who have been doing this work for decades. I also want to do a call out to SMERC, the Sexual and Gender Minority Resource Center, who was represented by Seth Johnstone today. We very much appreciate your work. And I also want to call out the Q Center, of course, which provides a variety of community-based, peer-led support and activity groups. Unfortunately, we need organizations like this because, as we have powerfully heard, transgender Portlanders still face discrimination. Commissioner Hardesty, I think, said that Black transgendered women are the most brutalized people on this planet, and I believe that is true. We also know that members of the transgender community suffer employment discrimination. They're more likely to find themselves in homeless situations. They're also more likely to suffer from hate crimes. And as we've heard over and over again today, our health system continues to poorly serve our transgendered friends and neighbors. Portland must do better. And today's celebration is one small step in that unsteady march towards doing better. So I'd like to close today by, on this Transgender Visibility Day, by saying that this council sees our transgendered friends and neighbors and colleagues, and you look like Portland. Thank you so much for the work that you do, and we look forward to seeing you next year.
Thank you, Commissioner Mapps. Commissioner Ryan.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, for bringing this forward. And thank you, Seraphy, Layla, and earlier, Aaron. You guys were great co-leaders of this. And Layla, I really liked what you said earlier about absorbing this, because this has been great and it's been a lot. And so it would be important to go back and take this in. So anyway, I appreciated that you mentioned that we should look into absorbing this deeper. I had a lot that I wrote down here, but I'm not going to use it because my heart's in this right now. And several things I want to say is I really heard the messages of direct action around housing and houselessness. I have the honor of being the commissioner in charge of those areas with all of my colleagues, of course. And it'll be front and center as we continue to build a better system of shelter, because everyone should have a right to lay down their head and have a safe, restful sleep, period. And I know someone mentioned that earlier. I appreciate that. That'll be in my remarks coming up later about the shelter to housing. I also want to say that to me, this has really been a journey as somebody who was really active in the lesbian, gay, queer community work in the 90s. I was the co-chair in Seattle for it was called the Lesbian and Gay Commission. I'll just tell this real quick story. Okay, most of you weren't even born. But anyway, here's what happened. We always had one gender. We had co-chairs, a boy and a girl, and if you will. And so the person who wanted to be the other co-chair identified as a female. But it was such a controversy because everyone was so hung up on whatever anatomy, and it was like, no, they identify as a female, so they're lesbian, and why is this a controversy? So I was the other side of that, and it must have been like a 3-month conversation, and that was in the 90s. It was like 97. So I just really want to thank all of you for people that are, becoming older, to just see where you are today and where you've taken this. It means a lot. I'm somebody that has been comfortable over the last couple of years being known as they or them when I think of it. And I need to really push myself harder to say that. my partner does identify as a they and them. And it's been really good for me to believe them, of course, right when we started dating. So basically it's this: we don't choose another person's identity. That's over. That is over. So I'm so grateful to have lived long enough and to reside in a city where I really do believe the majority agree about such common sense. This is just common sense. And so I really thank all of you. The performances, the words today were really compelling. I look forward to absorbing more later on. And this was a really wonderful way to begin the afternoon. I'll never forget it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner Ryan. And later on today, I'm going to toast to many happy decades ahead. So it's now my honor as the mayor to be able to read a proclamation on behalf of the City Council and by extension, the city. Transgender Day of Visibility Proclamation. Whereas transgender, transmasculine, transfeminine, non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, two-spirit, agender, and gender non-conforming people have always existed and made important contributions to their communities. And whereas transphobic cultures, including that of the United States, continue to suppress the existence and contributions of transgender and gender non-conforming people. And whereas transphobia requires disparities negatively affecting transgender and gender non-conforming people in health, housing, employment, and all major aspects of life. And whereas white supremacy, ableism, anti-Blackness, misogyny, and transphobia are interconnected and depend on the continued violence against Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who are transgender or gender non-conforming, particularly Black transgender women. And whereas houselessness and housing services providers consistently fail to provide safe, welcoming, and knowledgeable support for transgender and gender non-conforming people experiencing houselessness. And whereas amongst cities in the United States, Portland is home to the second largest percentage of LGBTQ+ people per capita, including transgender and gender non-conforming people. And whereas the city of Portland strives to make our community safe and empowering for its transgender and gender non-conforming residents. And whereas the city has not yet succeeded in this endeavor. And whereas visibility for transgender people is complex and nuanced and should not be a precondition for justice. And whereas Transgender Day of Visibility is an opportunity for the Portland City Council and the city as a whole to create a dynamic learning space focused on Portland's transgender and gender non-conforming community and recommit to partnering with the community to address our challenges. Now, therefore, I, Ted Wheeler, Mayor of the City of Portland, Oregon, the City of Roses, do hereby proclaim March 31st, 2021 to be Transgender Day of Visibility in Portland and encourage all residents to observe this day by committing to unlearning transphobia and cis-sexism and participating in the collective civic engagement necessary to make Portland a city and a safe and prosperous city for all. Thank you. And if we were in the council chambers, this is when we'd all be whooping it up and celebrating. Thank you, everybody, for participating today. Thank you for our leaders who created this space today. Thank you all who testified and shared your truths and your lived experiences. I hope that this will be something the community will benefit from for some time to come. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mayor, and we'll let you all get on to your next agenda item, and we will help follow up with the reading list that was recommended to all the offices.
Thank you, Sarah. We appreciate it. Thank you all. Megan, our next item is 202
Excuse me, Mayor.
Commissioner Hardesty, you bet.
Could we take a 10-minute break?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Why don't we take a break until 3:40 p.m. That's 10 minutes. We are in recess until 3:40 p.m.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pain in his back and has lost sensation in both legs, accuses authorities of ignoring his requests for medical attention. Instead, he says prison officials are depriving him of sleep by having him get woken up every hour during the night. The Kremlin has tried to downplay Navalny's condition, but German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Emmanuel Macron raised it in a video conference with President Putin Tuesday, sending a message that Western leaders will not forget about Navalny. Lucien Kim, NPR News, Moscow.
Stocks finished mixed on Wall Street today. You're listening to NPR News.
This is OPB. I'm Crystal Ligori. The U.S. Department of Education has rejected Oregon's request to completely waive standardized testing this spring. Elizabeth Miller reports.
Oregon education officials have said testing is not the best use of time for the little time students have left in the school year, and they said the tests may not yield useful information. Instead, the Oregon Department of Education suggested a survey to assess student needs and access to educational resources, and have districts do interim tests throughout the year. In its response to Oregon, the U.S. Department of Education said the survey is a good idea, but does not replace data collected from standardized tests. The Oregon Department of Education says it's still looking at options with the federal government. Elizabeth Miller, OPB.
Oregon Governor Kate Brown today declared a drought emergency in Klamath County. Much of the county in south central Oregon is experiencing extreme drought, according to the U.S. Drought Monitor. The governor said 2021 could be one of the worst water years in the Klamath Basin in recent memory. The Brown's emergency declaration frees up additional state resources to assist water users into the summer. Nearly 80% of the state is experiencing some level of drought. The head of Alaska Airlines said today the Seattle-based carrier supports the development of a COVID-19 vaccine passport as a means to help reopen international travel. Tom Bonsi has more.
A digital app on a smartphone, for example, could be a way for Americans to show proof of vaccination. Airlines, cruise lines, and foreign governments, among others, are looking at such COVID vaccine passports as a possible key enabler to restart international travel. Alaska Air CEO Ben Minicucci says he's on board.
The idea of an international vaccine passport has a lot of merit, and it's something that we should pursue aggressively if it opens up the international borders. That said, there are a lot of complexities with a vaccine passport.
Namely, agreeing on global standards and establishing privacy protections. The White House this week said the federal government will not get in the business of issuing vaccine passports, but will work with the private sector to develop standards for people to show they've been vaccinated. I'm Tom Bonsi reporting.
This is OPB. Find more news online at opb.org. It's 3:35.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Morgan Stanley, a proud sponsor of StoryCorps Connect, providing people with the ability to conduct a remote interview with loved ones at a distance at storycorpsconnect.org. From the Langloth Foundation, supporting justice, equity, and opportunity for all people to foster and sustain safe and healthy communities. Learn more at langloth.org. And from the ECMC Foundation at ecmcfoundation.org.
This is All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Elsa Chang in Los Angeles.
And I'm Ari Shapiro in Washington.
As March Madness comes to a close, the organization behind it is under fire. The National Collegiate Athletic Association proclaims itself a protector of amateurism in sports. But the NCAA also brings in more than $1 billion a year, and that has unpaid players demanding a different business model. Today, the Supreme Court heard arguments on an antitrust case involving the NCAA, and even if the justices don't force collegiate sports to change their business model, Congress and state legislatures across the country are starting to wade in. Nicole Auerbach is a college sports reporter with The Athletic. Welcome back to All Things Considered.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Let's start with today's Supreme Court hearing, which we're hearing about in more detail in another part of the show. Just give us a sense of what is at stake when the court rules, likely later this summer.
Well, this is actually tied to expenses related to educational benefits. So it's a little bit not as sexy as some people would like as a topic, but it is basically just looking at issues like internships and opportunities that other students have and whether or not college athletes can receive compensation for them. So it's not paying to play, it's not salaries, it's not making them employees, but it is tied to those topics, and it's tied to the elements of amateurism and just overall fairness for workers.
Which, as we mentioned, is a huge issue totally apart from the Supreme Court. And so let's talk about some of those other places this is boiling over. Like tomorrow, a group of players is set to meet with Senator Cory Booker, Democrat of New Jersey. Possibly there will be some representatives from the Biden administration at that meeting. What could happen at the federal level?
Well, this is actually happening kind of in a parallel track to what you're mentioning, which is basically reform around names, images, and likenesses for athletes. So when you think of that, you think of like a sponsored Instagram post or an endorsement deal with a local business. That is happening. There are states that have already passed laws, some to take effect as soon as this summer. You have the push for federal legislation in this space, which is Cory Booker is one of the senators that has been creating bills. There's 6 or 7 of them floating around of reform in this space that will supersede NCAA rules. So it's been fascinating to see so much bipartisan support and the willingness of different branches of the government to get involved here, where for so many years, they really did let the NCAA just do its own thing and create its own rules.
Besides the Supreme Court and Congress, there's been action in state legislatures. Tell us what's happening there and whether this is likely the beginning of a wave and more states are going to follow.
Well, it's been very popular, so more states are following, and everyone's trying to speed up their start dates, actually, because right now we're a couple of months away from some of these state laws taking effect, like Florida, and at this point, it feels like you're going to have Florida athletes allowed to do things that athletes in other states are not going to be, and we don't really know what that's going to play out and what that means for NCAA eligibility, how unpopular that would be if the NCAA tried to not let those athletes participate. And that's part of the reason that there's this urgency for a federal, national solution here that isn't there yet.
You know, as you point out, the NCAA for years was kind of able to write its own rules, call its own shots, and however these individual pressure points turn out, it seems fair to say things are changing and the NCAA is no longer entirely in control. So what's the big picture right now? Where do you see this going?
So it is going to be a different era of college sports. I personally don't think it will be all that different. I think that it just will feel more fair and there will be more of a shift, and you don't just have coaches making $9 million a year and the players not making anything beyond a scholarship. But I don't think that ultimately when you're watching a game it's going to feel all that different, but it will be a specifically different era in the history of college athletics in this country.
That's Nicole Auerbach, who reports on college sports for The Athletic. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Microsoft is reportedly in talks to acquire the social media platform Discord for $10 billion. Discord started as a gaming community, but now it's much more than that. It's a place for conferences, concerts, book clubs, and homework help. NPR's Bobby Allen reports.
Max Rokeats is an 18-year-old in the Chicago area who spent much of the last year hanging out on Discord. It started as a place to be with friends while playing video games. You can talk over text, audio, or video.
You can see when they're typing. It's a live conversation. It's really like a mix of like Reddit and a group chat.
And like Reddit, people on Discord chat under anonymous usernames, and many use anime characters and animal memes as their avatars. Some of the most popular communities are what you might expect: gaming, tech topics, cryptocurrency. But Rokit says increasingly, it doesn't just feel like a bubble for nerdy people who spend too much time on the
We're back
internet.
in session. It's
pandemic, a lot of my
3:40.
non-techie friends
I'm
have
going to
kind
do
of
this
come
slightly
onto Discord
differently
recently just to get
than
help with their homework.
the agenda suggests, or what the chiefs of staff may have discussed. I'm actually going to have us do items we're going to do 202 separately from 203 and 204. 203 and 204, there's no public testimony. There's only testimony on 202, which is the extension of the emergency. So we'll do that separately. We'll vote on it and we'll dispense with that. Then we'll move to 202 and 203 and 204 together. Can I get a head nod if that's okay with everybody? Good. Megan, can you go ahead and please call item number 202, time certain 3 p.m.
Extend state of housing emergency, operationalize efficiencies and identify council powers, specify a 12-month duration, and waive portions of the Portland zoning code.
Colleagues, this item extends the 2015 housing state of emergency for 1 year to April 4th, 2022. My office has led extending the housing state of emergency for 2 specific reasons. Number 1, this renewal directs the Portland Housing Bureau and the Bureau or the Office of Government Relations to monitor state and federal legislation related to the end of the housing relief, federal foreclosure moratorium, and the statewide eviction moratorium, House Bill 4401, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and related economic downturn. Number 2, in order to avoid a gap between the adoption amendments to the Shelter to Housing Continuum Code project introduced by Council shortly and the state of emergency, which is expiring, this extension gives Council the time to adopt those tweaks and changes. This particular emergency was first adopted by Mayor Charlie Hales, and the past councils would have more accurately called this a shelter shortage emergency, as the tools provided were primarily related to shelter siting. I'd like to see this council consider adopting a new set of tools that expand production of affordable housing and creates greater security for tenants and landlords should the protections afforded by the eviction and foreclosure moratoria be lifted without adequate protection for Portlanders. And before we have the staff presentation on this particular item, I'll ask if my colleagues have anything they want to share prior to that. Great. Can we get a brief presentation from staff on the extension of the state of housing emergency? Or alternatively, I'll just ask, does anybody have any questions of staff on this item? Not seeing any. Megan, has anybody signed up to testify on item 202?
Yes, we have 7 people on the call.
Let's go ahead and hear from the 7 individuals, please.
First up, Tim McCormick.
Thank you, Mayor, council members. My name is Tim McCormick. I'm the co-founder of PDX Shelter Forum and lead organizer at Village Collaborative. I'm here to support the extension of the Housing State of Emergency Declaration and say why, and say what I think we should do given this state of emergency. Oh, do I have 3 minutes?
You have 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Also, I want to honor the powerful testimony for Transgender Day of Visibility, which we just heard. And as Seraphy said, the feeling that others have that our slow government processes are not really rising to the reality of day-to-day fearing for one's life. One such person was Kim Lambright. She was found dead on Sunday. She was 53, living houseless, 1 mile right down Barber Boulevard from where I live, a location I've gone past hundreds of times in my life. It is heartbreaking to me that in all these years, in a declared state of emergency, we as a city have yet to offer safe places to be on the scale and range of ways needed for the thousands of people living like Kim was. So what is to be done? Now, if the emergency declaration is extended, as I believe is going to happen, One consequence is that we no longer have the imminent expiration deadline that was driving the shelter to housing continuum program. I propose that given this, and how brief the deliberation on that has been so far, and how recently most of the public even heard about this proposal, that a final vote on it be deferred in order to fairly discuss a number of important issues and community proposed amendments on S2HC, which were essentially not yet brought to council for public consideration. I encourage you and anyone in the public to look at these amendments as presented in the PDX Shelter Forum testimony letters referencing other groups, and in our co-authored Oregonian op-ed, all of which are available on top of the online testimony tool map app. I propose listen to the yet unheard ideas, consider them now, and potentially issue a directive along with it in S2HC to explore and address proposals in further work. For example, in the closely related Residential Infill Program Part 2, which is now kicking off at planning. Finally, this bill should direct planning and other city agencies to, as soon as possible, produce a public citywide lot level mapping of shelter eligible sites and a spreadsheet of, let's say, the top 100 suggested public and current institutional use sites. We need 50 to 100 well-qualified sites identified to build community action at the full scale of need and leading to action. The other 150,000 sites in the city don't matter so much in the current state of emergency. Every day we don't get those key steps done means thousands of people living in fear of death on the streets, and we simply cannot accept that as a humane city. Thank you, City Council, for your consideration and for letting me present to you today.
Thank you. Next individual, please, Megan.
Next up, Sean Green.
Welcome, Sean.
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. My name is Sean Green. I'm chair of the Northeast Coalition of Neighborhoods and co-founder of PDX Shelter Forum, Shelter Now, and a small business owner. I joined other representatives from a variety of organizations, including Victory Project PDX, Operation Night Watch, Interfaith Alliance on Poverty, Oregon Harbor of Hope, and many other leaders in community, neighborhood, business, and faith organizations in supporting the extension of the housing emergency in order to give us time to get the Shelter to Housing Continuum project right and to provide additional flexibility to respond to the needs of our community. As one who has been a part of most zoning code projects for the past decade, I feel that the Shelter to Housing Continuum project was being rushed before the draft was even publicly released. The reason given for the rush timeline was the lifting of the housing emergency. I feel strongly that we need to codify tools to help our unhoused neighbors, but given the complexity of the proposal and the variety of proposed amendments and new ideas that have emerged in the last few weeks and months, let's take this opportunity to get it right. Unfortunately, given state laws related to updating our zoning code, we know that if we want to make future improvements, we're going to need to go through the process all over again. Let's leverage the energy, interest, and resources to ensure that we set up our community for success as we respond to what many in the community consider to be one of the most important issues before us. I'm inspired by the way that Portlanders have stepped up and are ready to give our community the tools to help each other. Thank you.
Next, we have Caitlin Nissen.
Welcome, Caitlin.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm going to try and keep it very short for you guys. I'm completely echoing Tim and Sean. I think that this vote should definitely be delayed until more information is given to the community about the shelter to housing continuum. It's a big worry for a lot of people. I talked to a gentleman in Southeast Portland the other day. He's an immigrant from the Philippines. He just moved here, and there's a big homeless shelter right next to his house, a camp, if you will. But I'm just saying, you guys need to hear more from the community before we make these decisions. Robert Schultz, even on the 17th of this month, I got some really great information from him talking about how he's a single father of 3 kids. And he thinks that them seeing the houseless crisis we have here makes them think this is how people live. This is what dignity is. Even on those porta potties, it says this is not it's a human right. It's dignity. There's no dignity in the way people are living. So I just want to echo the people who have spoken before me, Tim McCormick, Sean Green, and Robert Schultz. Please delay the vote. Please do not pass the shelter to housing continuum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, Gay Gregor.
Good afternoon, Mayor Wheeler and council members. Many of the concerns that you have been hearing from parks advocates stem from the change in the code section that defines temporary activities allowed during an emergency. That's 33-296G. We've always supported including open space zone fully in the event of a natural disaster, a weather or a health emergency. But when shelter shortage was added to this section, we could no longer support it. If an emergency has been declared, which you're intending to do, this section now allows mass shelters and outdoor shelters in the open space zone for the duration of the emergency. We submitted an amendment that would fix this problem. The amendment first removes shelter shortage from section G. It establishes a new section to address shelter shortage. And in this new section, you can acknowledge the difference between this kind of an emergency and a natural disaster emergency. You can specify outside the open space zone, all activities are allowed. You can even narrow that down and specify outside parks and recreation properties. Section H, which would become section I in our recommendation, is the one that deals with temporary 180-day shelters if an emergency has not been declared. You've already removed the open space zone from this section, except for parking lots. Parking lots are an integral part of a park or community center. Suggesting that parking lots can be shared between park users and outdoor shelters, much the same way that farmers markets might share a parking lot, is quite frankly ridiculous. I don't think I need to explain to you the difference between a seasonal once-a-week farmers market and a 24/7 outdoor shelter. We recommend removing references to parks parking lots from this section altogether. Making the distinction between a shelter shortage emergency and other natural disaster-related emergencies simplifies the code and makes your intent clear. If you truly don't intend to place shelters in parks, as you say, you need to make this change to the code amendment currently under consideration. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. And I just want to clarify for folks that what's under discussion here is narrowly the extension of the housing emergency. If you are testifying on other items, that's not this. However, if you happen to agree with what you've heard, it sure wouldn't hurt just to say, I agree with what's already been said. That would also be sufficient.
Next up, Linda Robinson.
Okay, my name's Linda Robinson, and I want to say that I agree with the proposed amendment that Gay just mentioned, but also I'm concerned because it was my understanding that the reason for proposing the shelter to housing continuum was so that you didn't have to declare an emergency, but you are declaring an emergency kind of simultaneous. And so the things that can happen when you declare the emergency are not the same things that are in the shelter to housing continuum. It allows it to go on as it is, which means that they can camp, that the camps can occur in open spaces, any open spaces. So I'm worried about that. And I, quite frankly, agree with the folks in the Portland welcome housing that this really should be postponed because there are amendments to be considered, our amendment to be considered. There are probably other amendments that should be considered. There just hasn't, people are just learning about this. It may have been going on for 2 years, but almost none of us knew it was going on for 2 years. So I would agree with those. And, I think since you haven't agreed on everything in the shelter to housing continuum, you probably do have to do the extension of the emergency. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda.
Next, Zari Santner.
Welcome, Zari.
Good afternoon, Mayor and members of the council. I have to say that I'm in total agreement with your first three testifiers that suggested postponing the vote on the proposed shelter to housing continuum. And I'm submitting my testimony here, assuming you will vote on that issue. And if you do, here's my testimony. And I am basically begging you to exclude the use of city's entire park system for use as temporary shelters during a housing and shelter emergency declaration. I, like the previous testifiers, have always supported including open space zones fully in the event of a natural disaster or health emergencies and all the activities that would go with it and during its entire period of emergency. However, if you do change the code and include shelter shortage to Section G of the open space zone, then I no longer can support that. And I strongly urge you to amend the emergency declaration to exempt open space zones as sites for shelter, or amend the shelter to housing continuum proposal to exclude open space zones from being used for shelter site during an emergency, except obviously in the case of natural disaster or health emergencies. And Commissioner Rubio, as commissioner in charge of parks, if you don't have the votes to exclude city park system for use as temporary shelters during a housing shelter emergency, then I suggest that you require that applicants follow the Park Bureau's non-park use of parks processes and demand that the Bureau assess the property value of a park site at the same rate as the nearby commercial and residential properties. Thank you very much for paying attention to my testimony.
Thank you, Zari.
Our last testifier, Patricia Forbes, or Frobes, apologies.
Welcome, Patricia.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound good.
Good, thank you. I'm Pat Frobes. I was a former chair of the Portland Parks Board and parks advocate. Like others that have testified, I support the extension of the housing emergency, but believe you should delay the vote on the S2HC zoning code changes. I also need to reinforce that unless you do more, the declaration, when you couple that with the shelter to housing code amendments that are currently posted, will have the effect of permitting the use of parks as shelter sites for at least a year and inevitably longer. I urge you to either amend the declaration to make it clear that open space will not be used for shelter sites during the emergency, or amend the zoning code changes to exempt open space zone from use of shelter sites, except in the case of natural disasters or health emergencies. And I know you have the language that Gay Greger referred to for such an amendment. You've said that you don't intend to use parks as shelters. That reassurance rings hollow if you're not willing to translate that into an explicit exemption. And the reluctance to do so, I think, creates, frankly, a certain amount of distrust about your stated intentions. Please honor the commitment you made to voters when they approved the parks levy in November, namely to provide and improve access to parks for all Portlanders. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Megan, did you say that was the last public testimony on this item?
Correct. That concludes testimony.
All right. Very good. Lindley is going to tell us something, then Commissioner Hardesty. Lindley, go ahead.
Mayor, as you mentioned, the matter is on the housing emergency, not on sheltered housing continuum. I'd like to make sure that the testifiers are aware that the record right now in sheltered housing continuum is closed. And so if anything they are providing today, it will only be part of the record for the housing emergency ordinance, not sheltered housing continuum. Should council reopen the record, they could submit their testimony on sheltered housing at that time. I just want to make it clear for both staff and council and the testifiers.
Yeah, thank you, Lindley, for that clarification. Appreciate it. Commissioner Hardesty. Commissioner Hardesty, we don't hear you.
I think she's frozen.
Oh, is she? Hang on for a sec. I've got an idea.
Hi, Mayor. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you just fine. Yeah, thanks.
I'm on my phone because my computer just, whatever is happening with my internet happened.
Okay.
Were you ready for me to ask my question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Excellent. So my question has to do with what we're going to be measuring in this ordinance. Section H talks about the performance measures, but I don't see any performance measures as it relates to demographic breakdown or specific groups, like we heard earlier about transgender community members. Is there additional data that will be collected with this extension?
Could somebody from staff answer that question, please? Is there anybody from the Housing Bureau who is on this call?
Well, Mayor, if we cannot get an answer today, it would be my hope that we actually collected demographic data that would allow us to track who is being most impacted by being houseless in our community.
Yeah, I would assume somebody can answer the question. I mean, first of all, let's be clear. The language is exactly the same language that's been in place for several years. So there's no change, but surely somebody could tell us what data is currently being collected. All right. I guess not.
This is Jessica Connor. I'm the Senior Policy and Planning Coordinator at the Portland Housing Bureau. First, I apologize that we did not have a staff representative for this item. I'm actually up for the next item, but I will certainly get the information about what data is being collected and what can be collected so I can get that information to you.
Okay. And Mark Jolin might have some insight as well, maybe. I don't want to put Mark on the spot.
Yeah, I'm happy, Commissioner Hardesty, in terms of sort of what we collect and do know in the context of this emergency, but more broadly, of course, in terms of the demographics of who's experiencing homelessness and houselessness. It absolutely breaks down by race and ethnicity. We use inclusive identity measures of a very broad range of groups that folks can identify themselves with, and they can identify themselves with multiple communities. We're both able to understand the racial demographic makeup. When we do our counts, we also asked about gender identity, including transgender identity, so we're able to see that in the data. And then as we move people into housing through shelter programs, we also collect that same kind of information. So we're able to report back both who's experiencing homelessness and houselessness in our community, disaggregated in that way, as well as how people are faring in terms of their transitions into our various service programs and into housing. So we do routinely share that in any event. We'll certainly be able to share that back with respect to progress under the emergency declaration.
Mark, could I ask a question related to that? And I think Commissioner Hardesty will have a follow-up, but before she does, So the ordinance, as Commissioner Hardesty noted, is vague, but can we change or increase the types, or can we amend the types of data we are collecting? Does the ordinance allow that flexibility? In other words, is the specific data that we are collecting, is that an administrative decision?
I can't speak, Mayor, to what the ordinance allows or doesn't allow in terms of how it's drafted. Maybe the city attorney's office can. We can change what data gets collected in terms of our ongoing data collection practices within the homeless response system. And I know the Portland Housing Bureau also collects racial demographic data for folks in their housing programs. That does take some work to shift those systems. So it would be an analysis of what it is specifically that we're not collecting that you would like to see collected. And then we'd have to come back to you with a proposal about what that would take.
Yeah, and I don't have anything in particular in mind. It just occurred to me, I was sort of prompted by Commissioner Hardesty's question that obviously we would want our data sets to evolve as our data collection needs to evolve. And I'm assuming that's allowed under the terms of the ordinance. Commissioner Hardesty, you're back in.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Mark, for that response. I know that you internally collect that data. I guess my question is, if we're looking systemically about who's being impacted by housing, this is just City of Portland point in time data. And so I just want to make sure that we are actually collecting data that will be useful for us long term. And because we're not actually being intentional about saying we are in fact collecting data that is around demographics and age, as well as transgender community folks, I'm just concerned that it just won't be collected if it's not spelled out.
So, Commissioner, I can reassure you, we collect that data, and it isn't just for internal purposes. We also report it out. So, if you look at our point in time count, you see breakout by age, by gender identity, by race and ethnicity, and then if you look at our sort of report outs, we're always disaggregating by race. We can pull the reports around age and due. I think the data is there, and it can be made available. It is made available on a regular basis, but it can also very specifically be brought for council's consideration at the points in time where you need it.
Yeah, I thank you for that. I think it would be very helpful for us to have a quarterly report on kind of what we're seeing around this demographic data, because, my fear is at the end of the year, we get a complete count, but it doesn't tell us actually whether or not we're having an impact with specific demographics along the way. So thank you. Mayor, I don't want to take up too much more time on this, but I just noticed that just seemed like a clear, it appears that we're collecting data for HUD and not necessarily for us in this resolution. Thank you.
Very good. Any further council questions or discussion on this item? Megan, please call the roll on 202.
Rubio.
Aye.
Ryan.
Hi, thank you, sorry. Well, I know my answer is aye, and I'm really grateful that we got on this and took it on today. Thank you, aye.
Hardesty.
Love to see more demographic breakdown data. When it's reported back, I vote aye.
Maps.
Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye, the ordinance is approved. Can you please, Megan, read items 203 and 204 together?
Amend Title 33 Planning and Zoning to facilitate the provision of shelter and housing options for Portlanders in need. Item 204. Amend City Code Health and Sanitation, Emergency Code, Public Improvements, Water, Property Maintenance Regulations, and Affordable Housing to facilitate the provision of shelter and housing options for Portlanders in need.
Thank you. Colleagues, last week we discussed what we heard in our testimony, and we identified potential amendments. Today, we're going to begin work on motioning, seconding, and then voting on amendments to the Shelter to Housing Continuum package. We will not be voting on the main motion, just on the amendments. Before doing so, I ask that Bureau staff provide us with a summary of the testimony since our last meeting. And just to give you a bit of a flow of the show, we're going to talk about the summary of the testimony in just a moment. I'm going to ask each of my colleagues if they have any opening remarks that they would like to share. It's certainly not mandatory. We will then go through the process. We will be guided through the process of offering up specific amendments, and we will be asking for a second on those amendments, and then discussion and then a vote on those particular amendments. And we'll go through each of the different facets of the sheltered housing continuum proposed amendments. And so with that, we'll start with a summary of the testimony that we heard last week, or since last week's meeting. People were able to provide written testimony. So I'll introduce Eric Engstrom and Joe Zender from BPS. Welcome.
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. Once you get into the consideration of the motions and votes, I will put up a PowerPoint to help structure that conversation. But before I do that, I'll just give you a brief summary of what I've seen in the public comments over the past week since we last met. And for the record, this is Eric Engstrom with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I think the number one trend in the testimony continues to be concern about parks and shelters. That's fairly obvious in reading through the remarks. Another common theme is general frustration about the situation we see on the street with camping. A lot of folks have connected the dots between voting for additional support for homeless services and their perception that things are still getting worse. And I think there are a lot of reasons why that's happening, and probably it points to the need for continued communication on that issue about what our next steps are beyond just the shelter and housing regulations, but just in terms of homeless services more broadly. This week, there was a thread of testimony related to Portland International Raceway, and I'm not sure what generated that exactly, but we got a lot of letters concerned that we might be converting that facility into a shelter facility. We did get some support letters for the package as a whole and some of the amendments on the table. We got a slight increase in testimony, I think, related to the RVs and tiny houses on wheels. Some letters of support for that, some opposition, some letters related to sewer questions, the presentation you got last week from BES. There is some confusion in some of that testimony. Folks have conflated their observation of the RVs beside the road with our proposal to consider RVs on residential lots, and those are different things, but there is some testimony just expressing concern about RVs camping along the road. There was not a huge number of specific letters about your amendments that were floated last week, but a few, both in support and urging more. That, I think, is a brief summary. There's, as I said, the dominant theme by far was the concern about the use of park space.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Joe, did you have anything else to add?
Not at this time.
Okay, very good. Then this is a time that I'll set aside for my colleagues if they have any opening remarks. Commissioner Rubio, somebody pinged me and suggested you might. Commissioner Rubio.
Thank you, Mayor, and all of my colleagues for your collaboration through this process. I just wanted to say that I felt really good about the work that we've been doing over the past couple of weeks. We took the time that we needed to authentically engage with each other and work together on shaping this policy. And we wouldn't have gotten there without the staff at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and especially Eric Engstrom and the members from the Planning and Sustainability Commission. Eric and his team helped us understand the ins and outs of the proposal during this time and helped us craft amendments that got exactly what the things that we wanted to resolve and clarify. And I also can't forget to thank former BPS staff Al Burns, a lead on this project before he retired this year. And also a very big thanks and appreciation to my policy director, Rico Lujan Valerio, and senior policy advisor, Cynthia Castro. They both spent countless hours listening and meeting with communities and advocates, deliberating on this policy and advising me on this complex but important policy. I also want to acknowledge the hardworking staffs of all my colleagues, all of your offices, Zach Curl, Adam Lyons, Mark Bond, and Derek Bradley. It's been really great collaborating among our teams and our offices. And finally, and most importantly, we wouldn't have gotten to today without all of the numerous community members who submitted testimony, met with us, called or emailed our offices, posted about the proposal on social media, or attended a listening session during the proposal's development. And whatever your perspective is, we know that everyone will have different opinions. There's a lot of opinions coming into this, and everyone will have different opinions about whatever we end up passing. And if you fall into that place where you're not very happy, whatever the outcome is, it's still important that we express that, and that we did all hear you, and we spent a great deal of time thoughtfully and thoroughly discussing what you conveyed to us, and you all truly helped us to make a sharper and more focused policy, better designed to achieve its truest and clearest intention. And if it's a different conclusion than your preferred outcome about the best course for the city right now, please know that your contributions have made both this proposal and our city better. And in evaluating this proposal, last thing I'll say, I've been looking for whether this policy, for me personally, reflects what it was constructively intended to do, and that also provides children who are houseless the best possible opportunity to succeed, and also maximizes community safety and reinforces that Portlanders experiencing houselessness are treated with dignity and respect. So I'm confident that between the policy as written and the amendments we are considering, we are meeting all these key benchmarks.
Thank you, Commissioner Rubio. Commissioner Ryan.
Yes, excuse me. Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to echo the sentiments of Commissioner Rubio. I'm just so grateful to the extensive input and collaboration that's taken place throughout this process, whether it's across our city's bureaus, our council offices, and the wealth of public testimony that we have received. Thank you. This past year has brought multiple crises of economic devastation to Portland, and the impacts is felt most strongly amongst our most vulnerable neighbors. We see the impacts all around us. Even though vaccination rates are climbing, the economic impacts of COVID-19 are still very much upon us. Just minutes ago, we renewed a housing state of emergency due to a looming housing crisis coinciding with the lifting of the statewide eviction moratorium. Now we need to pass a code change package that gives the city as much flexibility as possible in providing services to those who need them most, while also being responsive to testimony provided by the community. Our offices, council staff, and bureau staff have worked very hard to take community feedback and then put together a suite of amendments that make this code change package as effective as possible while avoiding unintended consequences. What I've said from the beginning is that we need to meet our houseless community where they are, and we need to build forward around a value we all share, that everyone deserves a safe place to sleep with services that provide stability and resilience that can one day lead to stability in housing. We have 34 proposals that have been submitted to that Joint Office of Homeless Services to provide alternative shelters in our community. The desire to expand alternative shelter is there, and these proposed code changes are the other half of that equation. I want to extend my sincere thanks to all the staff who have worked together to get us to this point, and I look forward to today's discussion and to the passage of this critical policy.
Thank you, Commissioner Ryan. Commissioner Mapps.
I apologize. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, colleagues, and thank you to everyone who's tuning in. I largely want to echo the themes my colleagues have hit on this afternoon. Especially, I'd like to recognize staff over at BPS who have worked so hard to get us to this point. Eric Engstrom, Al Burns, and Joe all deserve our gratitude. I know how hard you have been working. The same thing is true with council staff who have been working night and day to get us to this point. I also want to recognize all the community advocates who've reached out to us, either testified before this group, emailed or called. We heard you and you have made us smarter. I believe the Shelter to Housing Continuum project is an historic opportunity for the city to improve its zoning codes, to better accommodate the needs of our most vulnerable neighbors. I think it shows us that our current zoning code is largely inadequate to the challenges that houselessness presents. And I'm hopeful that the ordinance that we ultimately pass will enable us to serve our community better and provide housing to people desperately in need. I believe ultimately that every Portlander deserves a home, and I think this policy will help us achieve that.
Thank you, Commissioner Mapps. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you. Thank you, BPS staff. Thank you to the public that have written and provided testimony and have been very vocal about what they liked and didn't like about this proposal. I think I want to start at the beginning. We are in a crisis. We do not have enough housing that Portlanders can afford to live in, that is safe, that is affordable, and that is accessible. We've heard all day today, starting with this morning as we celebrated Cesar Chavez Day, that we have an entire community that is housing insecure all over the city of Portland, and that was even prior to the pandemic. We heard this afternoon about transgender people who are discriminated against in housing opportunities and how income insecure they are, and what challenges they have been facing since the pandemic. Without extending the housing emergency, we could expect tens of thousands of more people to be living on the streets in the city of Portland. When we actually did RIP, the residential infill project, there was a lot of fear of change, fear of my neighborhood's gonna look different, fear of, well, what about me? The reality is that we all will change to accommodate the need that we currently have in the city of Portland. And the need that we desperately have, and people see it every day on our streets, is a need for a variety of options for our houseless community members as we assist in transitioning to permanent housing where that people can afford to live in with support services for those who need it. That means any unused land should have the opportunity to determine whether it could benefit those with almost nothing. I appreciate the hard work of Commissioner Rubio and Commissioner Ryan. These are never easy conversations. It is never easy to tell people that have a door and a roof that people without one deserve the same type of dignity that those with a roof and door deserve. This won't fix all our problems, but it certainly moves us in the right direction. And I hope my colleagues, I plan to support my colleagues in getting this voted on as quickly as possible so that we can start the healing of so many people who are in crises on our street. Thank you for the hard work. I look forward to us getting to the amendments and the vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. And I want to echo my appreciation for the great staff work that went into this, all the council offices, for BPS, who worked tirelessly in helping to shape this. policy. And I want to call out Johnny Lewis from OMF, and he worked really, really hard to convene the work group with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. So thanks to you too, Johnny. And thank you to the many Portlanders who we've heard from throughout this process. We've listened to your thoughts, your critiques, and we've incorporated your suggestions where we felt that it was appropriate to do so. And we appreciate all those thoughtful comments. We will not be getting through all of the amendments today. And for those items that we do not vote on today, I hope to continue receiving valuable testimony from the community. We will continue to need tools to address homelessness long after the expiration of the declared state of emergency. And I believe this project provides clarity on how and where these assets to the community can be located. I trust that the changes that will be offered up in some of these amendments will help us open more facilities that offer a safe space to shelter, while also providing services to help people experiencing homelessness move towards permanent housing. That is the whole purpose of this entire effort. Now I'm going to turn it over to Joe Zender. He's going to help us navigate through the amendments that we plan on getting through today. Good afternoon, Joe.
Great. Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. For the record, I'm Joe Zender. I'm Chief Planner with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. And we have a PowerPoint that we're going to use to sort of facilitate the discussion today. So Eric, if you want to launch that. Okay, and just today, just a reminder at a high level, the Shelter to Housing Continuum Project touched on regulations that apply to the creation of and development of shelters, created a new type of legally sanctioned shelter, an outdoor shelter, liberalized or changed rules related to group living, and also took up the topic of allowing tiny houses on wheels and RVs as part of the housing mix. Today, we're going to be talking about 3 of those topics. The other part I wanted to remind you about was that there's been public discussion of this for the project's been going for 2 years, and the public deliberations for them started at the Planning and Sustainability Commission and extended throughout December and January of this year. And we are now, after a public hearing on the 17th, heading into the amendment process. And the amendments you're going to see today, Eric, you can switch, are drawn from what we heard in the hearings and the discussions that we've been having with you all in your offices and the areas of interest that you've expressed. So to facilitate this, we've organized, we have 7 amendments to get through this afternoon. We've organized them in 3 main areas, and you see those color-coded here. The first area is parks, natural areas, and open space. And there's 2 amendments that are related to that. Each of the rows in this table, if you're looking at it, is one of the amendments that we're going to discuss, or one of the topic areas. Some have more than one topic. For instance, that first one is both addressing overlays and the open space zone, but a single motion is what we would be hoping for and vote to adopt wherever you all land on that particular, and we're just going to go through all 7. Eric's going to lead us through one at a time. Also in this table, you'll notice that there's in the right-hand column a reference to page numbers, and that's a reference to the memo that we provided a new, fresh copy of today, an updated copy of today before the hearing. So if you want to see the exact language of the amendment, you can go and it will be there and track changes. What Eric's going to show us and lead us through is sort of a higher level summary of what the point is for each of these amendments. So with that, I think we're going to start with the first amendment in the grouping that's related to parks, natural area, and open space. Eric?
Thank you, Joe. So I want to just make a clarification here that this is a bundled amendment because both of these amendments amend the same set of sentences in the zoning code. So we had to weave them together to make sense of it for you. The first element of it non-emergency temporary shelters would not occur in natural areas in any zone. And this is embodied by a group of overlay zones that represent natural areas in the city's zoning code. There is a related technical change to the section of code that makes permanent shelters, just to make sure that list of overlays is the same list in both places in the code. And then the second one here is related to non-emergency temporary outdoor shelters. These are the ones in the draft that are allowed up to 180 days outside of the emergency. And this amendment would clarify that those would not occur in open space zones. And by way of nomenclature, I just want to also make it clear that the code language you see in the memo is in strike through and underlined format, and that is relative to the current code. The shaded area is the area that has been changed for purposes of the amendment, if that makes sense. So we're amending the original change document in our report, essentially. So this amendment, or this pair of amendments, affects section H in 33296030. And then the related change to make sure the overlay zones match is in section 33285.050C1 on the following page. So taken together, these things do what is on the screen. They prohibit the non-emergency temporary shelters from being in the natural areas, and they remove the open space zone from the temporary outdoor shelter provision. You would retain the ability to use the OS zone through the emergency clause in section G above as written.
So the pattern that we'd like to establish is that that concludes Eric's presentation on this amendment. If you have any questions, this would be the time to ask those. If there are no questions, we could move to your deliberation or motion.
Commissioner Mapps.
I'd like some clarification from staff about what 1.2 would do in the real world, specifically in the context of, let's say, parks.
So 1.2 is primarily embodied in section H sub 2, where it now says outside of OS zones. So outdoor shelters would not be allowed outside of an emergency declaration. Outdoor shelters would not be allowed in parks because parks are zoned OS. And so that just removes that entirely. The emergency clause in G above would still allow that through an emergency declaration.
Okay, so let's imagine a scenario. If we wanted to, if we pass this, could we set up a mass outdoor shelter in a parking lot?
No, this language has, relative to the language we had discussed last week, the current language before you does not have the parking lot provision in it.
Okay, but if we needed to use a community center that's attached to parks for shelter, can we do that?
You can. The mass shelter is the indoor form of shelter, and that does not have the OS exclusion. So you could continue to use indoor facilities in that way.
Okay, and as long as we're just doing this, let's go back up to 1.1, just so I'm clear what this says. So, Portland has many beautiful open natural areas, and this would prevent us from setting up mass outdoor shelters in just natural areas?
Correct. The specific overlays listed are the environmental overlay zones, which represent resources that have been inventoried.
You guys didn't hear Park West and West Little Rock Pharmacy.
The river natural is that same thing, but along the Willamette River. River environmental is similar. Pleasant Valley is a specific brand of overlay zone that is in place in one particular district, and then the flood hazard area is equivalent to the 100-year floodplain. So all of those are mapped across a variety of zones in the city, including residential and commercial and open space, and so all of those lands, regardless of the zoning, of the basic zoning, would be excluded from the outdoor shelter.
I got it. Thank you very much.
Mr. Hurst.
You want to go around that way? Sure.
Thank you. Joe, were there people sleeping in our parks and our open spaces prior to the pandemic?
Commissioner, I'm not exact. In most cities there are, but I do not think that was a sanctioned practice for sure.
No,
that's what you're asking.
No, I didn't say sanction. I just asked if there were people prior to the pandemic sleeping in open spaces in the city of Portland.
Sleeping in open spaces, yes.
Yes. And we anticipate whatever we do with the zone change, there will still be people sleeping in open spaces. Am I accurate to make that assumption?
Yes.
Thank you. I just wanted that on the public record. Appreciate it.
You're correct.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question as well, just to make sure I understand. So, does this prohibit temporary shelters in natural area overlays in all zones?
Yes.
Okay, and this limits temporary shelters in the open space zone to indoor mass shelters only, is that correct?
Yes.
So parks are out, parking lots are out, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted that clarification. So Joe, just to make sure I understand how we want to go through this. So now I guess the question is, you're asking for a motion and a second. Are you asking for it on 1.1 and 1.2 individually, or are you asking us to do it as a package?
Each of these will be presented, this one is as a package, Mayor, since they're the same section of code. So the motion would be to make amendments that would implement the language that you're seeing here listed on the slide for 1.1 and 1.2.
Okay, good. And then you would want us, once we have a motion and a second, if there's no further discussion, you would want us to go ahead and vote. Is that correct? On the
Yes,
amendment?
I think that's going to be the clearest for us to walk through it.
Okay, and then these amendments will go to a later session where we will vote on the main motions as amended. Is that correct?
We will deliver to you a revised and as amended version of the code, and that's what you will adopt as a package.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, good. So colleagues, hopefully that was as clear as mud. So I will be seeking a motion on 1.1 and 1.2 as a package and a second.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Hardesty. We have a second from Commissioner Ryan. Is there further discussion on this package of amendments? Please call the roll, Megan.
Rubio.
I just want to say, my office and other offices had numerous conversations with providers, bureau staff, and we feel very comfortable with the amendment because this was not the preferred option nor intention, and rather our focus should be on permanency solutions. And we need to look at available city-owned land for these potentially permanent sites. Bye.
Ryan.
Yeah, I'm really glad we're voting to clarify the intent of the proposed code change here, and and I hope that this amendment provides a reassurance to concerned community members. I vote aye.
Hardesty.
Aye.
Maps.
Aye.
Wheeler.
Well, we've learned from the last 5 years that it's inadvisable to create temporary shelter except under very certain conditions, like providing severe weather shelter or other finite elements in which the health and safety of people living outside is at an elevated risk. That is why I would support 1.1, for temporary shelter to be successful, it requires a certain base level of infrastructure. I agree with my colleagues that natural and environmentally sensitive areas are not appropriate for this purpose. So I support 1.1. With regard to 1.2, we've heard public and written testimony on this issue about setting limitations on the temporary use of shelters in open spaces. We were very clear with our intent. This language clarifies and codifies that intent. And so I am prepared to support 1.2. Therefore, I vote aye on the package. The amendment carries. Joe, what's next?
Great. Eric, next amendment is related to parks and natural areas as well.
Thank you, Joe. So this came out of one of the options that was came up in testimony, and that was a request that we look at our surplus property. And this is an amendment that operates outside of the zoning code. It would actually be an additional directive in the ordinance rather than an amendment to the actual zoning code. But it would direct property owning bureaus to do an inventory of surplus property that would be suitable for transitional shelter or affordable housing. And there are some caveats about it not having a use restriction. There's some issues that we would have to resolve around the color of money and how those lands were purchased. And we also don't want these lands, again, to be natural areas or open spaces. And then it would direct us, where appropriate, there may be further planning on some of these sites, depending on what they are. They may require rezoning or other ownership transfers. So there would be more work to do on this, but this directive would set the ball rolling with the bureaus that have a property inventory to look through that. And one thing that's not super clear in what's written in your memo that I think we want to clarify is which ordinance could, because there are two ordinances in the shelter to housing package. One is the ordinance that amends the zoning code, and the other second ordinance is the one that amends the non-zoning codes. And it's my sense that this additional directive would probably be best placed in that second ordinance, because this is not really a zoning directive, but I would look to the city attorney, if they're on the call, to just see if they have an agreement with me on that recommendation.
I think it's really up to council. I don't think it's better in one place or the other.
We just have to decide one or both, or decide how it's going to be.
Here with everybody, we love our trans community. We are one.
And again,
So based on what Eric just said, we would recommend for clarity to put it in the second ordinance. Is there an ordinance number that you want to clarify with that, Eric? Or?
It's the one that maybe the clerk can help me out here. It's the one that has the non-zoning code list of titles.
Okay.
That
should be sufficient.
There is enough of us to
Okay, good. Commissioner Hardesty, you have a question?
Thank you, Mayor. I was just going to recommend that we go with the recommendation, which was the number 2.
Good, okay.
And the non-use portion.
Okay, good. So do you need a motion then on 103?
Yes.
All right, we'll entertain a motion in a second on 103.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Rubio, a second from Commissioner Hardesty. Any further discussion? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Rubio.
Aye.
Ryan.
Aye.
Hardesty.
I know there's going to be other action the city council will have to take in order to make this, to realize this section, but I'm glad to see that we are identifying that city-owned land should be identified and made available. I vote aye.
Maps.
Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye. The amendment carries. Next,
Mayor, I have one clarification. I apologize for not catching this earlier, but there was some things crossed in the mail at the last minute, and there was a question about the date that's in this directive, and this is on page page 4 of your memo, the date that's in the memo is October 31st, and there had been some back and forth about whether it should be October 31st that is the due date for bureaus to get back to council, or if it's the end of June. And I just wanted to make sure that if there was an intent to make it the end of June, we might want to further amend that amendment or take another motion.
Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor. The intent was to have it in June. And so if the document that you are looking at says December, I would modify the motion to make the date June of 2021.
And that was June 30th.
June 30th?
Yeah.
Yes.
Commissioner Ryan, did you have anything else to add on that?
No, I was going to say, 3 months, June 30th. So I'd like that amended, that added.
Okay, legal counsel, is this a Scrivener's error, or should we call the roll on the amendment to the amendment?
I just call a quick roll call. I make
very
a
good.
move and second, and then quick roll call.
So Commissioner Hardesty, can I get you to move this amendment? Commissioner,
The amendment.
Is the amendment to the amendment changing the date to June 30th? Call the roll, please.
Rubio.
Aye.
Ryan.
I just want to thank the staff in advance for your urgency. Aye.
Hardesty.
Aye.
Maps.
Aye.
Wheeler.
Tight timeline but doable. Aye. The amendment to the amendment carries. And
Right, so we're moving on to the next category.
Commissioner Hardesty has a question, and before we move on to the category, I think we have to make a motion now to accept the amendment as amended. Do we not, legal counsel?
I am comfortable that at this point you've moved I think you're done.
Good. Commissioner Hardesty.
If we're done, I'm done. I'll put my hand.
All right, I reached the same conclusion. All right, Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't see the hands up. Second category, 3 amendments are coming. These are application to regulations about shelters or shelter-related standards. So Eric, we're going to do each of these once again, one at a time.
So this first one was circulated initially in a staff technical memo, and then it's repeated in the current memo that you have before you. It's rewording the outdoor shelter definition that would be in the definitions use categories. There's several things happening with that rewording. One is it was kind of a long sentence, and so we broke it up. Another was how parking was handled in the wording, and it was potentially up to interpretation in several different ways, so we clarified that. And then there was a question about previous definition didn't adequately identify sanitary facilities as part of the use. And there was some potential for confusion about that, and so we clarified that as well.
Especially growing up here in Arkansas.
I had complete rewording,
little to no friends, and that's going to happen because we're in the place that we are. But I went to Conway and met my family.
All right, very good.
And there are.
So you're looking for a motion?
Love you for you.
Yeah, if there are any questions, we'll take those, and then a motion's appropriate. Thank you.
You just got to tough it out until you can get to a better.
Commissioner Hardesty, are you moving these?
Yes, I moved 2.1.
Commissioner Hardesty moves. Is there a second?
Second.
Commissioner Maps seconds. Any further discussion? Please call the roll.
Rubio.
Aye.
Ryan.
Aye.
Hardesty.
Aye.
Maps.
Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye. The amendment is carried. Thank you.
Today, where I knew I was going to be around my people, and I was like, I don't have to worry about any of that.
Take it away, Eric.
This next one is a small change. There's a minimum site size requirement for outdoor shelters in the proposed standards. And there's been a proposal to change it from 5,000 to 3,000. For reference, 5,000 is kind of the standard residential lot size in Portland. 3,000 is the minimum lot size for many residential zones. The origin of this was that one of the existing outdoor shelter sites was smaller than 5,000 slightly, and although that particular site is actually in a right of way and wouldn't be subject to this particular standard, it led us to just consider that the standard was in place might be a little bit too strict, and so we proposed to change it downwards slightly.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardison.
I move we accept 2.3 amendment.
And I'll second that. Commissioner Hardison moves, I second. Any further discussion on this item? Please call the roll.
Rubio.
Aye.
Ryan.
Aye.
Hardesty.
Aye.
Maps.
Aye.
Wheeler.
Well, as we discussed last week, we have models of outdoor shelter that have proven effective at less than 5,000 square feet, but there was consensus that we didn't want to go down to 0, so we were looking for an intermediate number, and I appreciate the BPS team suggesting the 3,000 square foot, which comports with the smallest legal lot size. I think that seems like a reasonable cutoff point, so I'm happy to support this amendment. I vote aye, the amendment carries.
The next item concerns right-of-way encroachments, and this is in Title 17.44. This section, what we're proposing here is just for you to remove the amendments in this section entirely from the package. So the current language is shown for your reference, but you're not actually changing anything. You're just directing us to not change this section of code and remove it from the proposal. A couple things going on here. One is this is a PBOT administered code, and they are looking towards a broader refresh of some elements of Title 17 and would like to be able to consider this holistically. In the meantime, there's a separate section that in 17.24, which addresses the question of encroachments adequately. And the concern here is just the ability to place sanitation facilities and other things that may support homo services in the right-of-way on occasion. And we're confident that through 17.24, you have enough ability to do that now that we can postpone further changes to this code until PBOT has a chance to look at it together with everything else they're doing.
Commissioner Hardison.
Thank you, Mayor. I move that we drop 17.44 from the amendments.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second from Commissioner Rubio. Any further discussion? Megan, please call the roll.
Rubio.
Aye.
Ryan.
Aye.
Hardesty.
I am very appreciative that we work cooperatively together to be able to decide that we could do this one at another time. I look forward to the overall updates from PBOT on Title 17 at a future date. I vote aye.
Maps.
Aye.
Wheeler.
I understand from what has been indicated previously as well as today that PBOT has said that the existing language in code allows them to permit shelter and other day use services that have proven to be incredibly important services and resources for people experiencing houselessness. This will still continue that. It also gives PBOT the breathing room to come up with a more holistic code as they've expressed a desire to do. I vote yes to this amendment, and the amendment carries.
Okay, so this is another bundle, and this deals with the remaining technical amendments to the group living section of the code package. You have not received too much testimony about this element of the code, but in the staff technical memo that was circulated a few weeks ago, we had 3 things that we asked you to do. All of these relate to the development standards that apply to congregate structures. And when we restructured the definition of group living, we created a new term, and in making that transition, we left a few loose ends in the code that we need to connect the dots on. And those 3 things are, one is to clarify what floor area ratio or building size standard would apply to congregate structures in single dwelling zones, what outdoor area requirements would apply to congregate structures in any of the zones, and then clarify the parking requirements for congregate structures. And that last thing, you may remember with the residential infill project that you removed most off-street parking requirements from single dwelling homes in the household living category, and this would sort of clarify the equivalent for the new group living category that we're now allowing by right. And so those three things I think are largely technical clarifications to make sure that the Bureau of Development Services is not left hanging wondering which standards apply.
Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you, Mayor. I move we accept 4.1-4.3 changes, amendment.
Is there a second?
Second.
We have a second from Commissioner Mapps. Any further discussion? Megan, please call the roll.
Rubio.
Aye.
Ryan.
Aye.
Hardesty.
Aye.
Mapps.
Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye. The amendments are adopted.
And this is the last item that we had on today's menu. This clarifies for the short-term rental code, it had pointed to the word household, which is a defined term that we are removing from the code. And that left BDS with some questions about how they would enforce the number of people staying in a short-term rental. Functionally, the definition of household referred to up to 5 unrelated people. And so functionally 5 was what they were operating under in the old code. And we're just changing the code now to remove the reference to household and instead explicitly say 5 guests. We think this is the functional equivalent of the current code. It just cleans up any ambiguity that BDS may face in enforcement of the occupancy limits for short-term rental.
Commissioner Hardesty.
So, Mayor, I move that we adopt the 4.4 amendment as presented.
We have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
We have a second from Commissioner Ryan. And do we have discussion on this item before we call the roll? Commissioner Hardesty.
Oh, no, Mayor, I'm sorry. I didn't put my hand down.
No, I know there's a lot of hand raising and hand putting. After a while, your little finger starts to hurt, doesn't it?
It does, up and down, up and down.
Please call the roll.
Rubio.
Aye.
Ryan.
Aye.
Hardesty.
I just want to thank BPS. This is a long overdue change. We've heard this, at least I've heard this for years, that people who want to collectively live together were restricted based on a very weird definition of household. So thank you for this. I vote aye.
Mapps.
Aye.
Wheeler.
Aye. The amendment's adopted.
We're on to the next steps now, which talks about our next hearing, and I believe that you are going to lead us into that.
All right. So the 2 items that are above these areas of code were more recent additions to the project. Were based on testimony. We'd like to hear more testimony from the public about the proposed changes that are proposed. So we'd like to carry these items over. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yes, Mayor. The 2 items are the proposal to allow shelters without a conditional use up to 20 beds on institutional sites in single dwelling zones, which is largely a faith-based institution. And then the second was the request that we invite further testimony on the RV and tiny house element of the package, which both the amendment for the institutional sites in single dwelling zones, that's in your packet for reference. And then also the entire code for the tiny house and RV element is also in your packet. It's in Title 29 and 1 chapter in the zoning code. So it's my understanding that we would seek further testimony on these.
Yeah, so Eric, that was 2.2 and 3.1 in our original list. Is that correct?
2.2 and 3.1, correct. The memo lists them as those numbers, and we would be carrying those forward to the 14th.
Okay, so the question I have is, is there any action required by the council in order to carry these items over to our next discussion on April 14th? And I guess, Lindley, that's a question for you.
Mayor, I think you need to do two things. One is obviously we're carrying it over to a time and date certain, and so have council confirm that. And the second is that currently the record is closed, so council would, if you anticipate taking written testimony before the 14th, reopen the record and let people know how they can submit testimony.
Okay, so colleagues, let's do this in order. First of all, can I get at least a thumb raise or a hand raise or just nods yes if you're willing to carry these two items over 2.2 and 3.1? And the proposal is to carry it over to April 14th. Megan, could we get a time certain on that, please?
Yes, we have time held at 2 p.m. on April 14th.
Okay, and it looks like I'm seeing all my colleagues nod up and down, so that's a go. So we will carry these two items over to April 14th, 2 p.m. time certain. Colleagues, does anybody object to our keeping the record open up until that time?
Mayor, I have a question about that. Is the record open just on these two new considerations, or is the entire record going to be reopened?
Lindley, wasn't your intention just on these two items?
I might refer that back to Eric, but I thought I had heard that the goal would, because council has closed out its amendment packages today, encourage people to focus on the new two proposals that you'll be considering on that date.
Thank you, because I did not want there to be an impression that we were going to take additional testimony on the entire package.
Yeah, it's my understanding, Commissioner Hardesty, it's certainly my intent, let's put it that way. My intent is that it just be on these two proposed amendments that we extend the public testimony time.
I support that.
And so, Eric, could you suggest a time when we would close the public record on these two items?
Well, I think I would suggest that, and I can reopen the written record for online comments after this meeting is over. It's closed right now, but I can reopen that as soon as the meeting's over. I would suggest keeping the written record open until the close of your hearing on the 14th. And then if I understood correctly, there was an intent to allow oral testimony on the 14th for these two items. And so if that's the case, then we would, once we got the link to the right Zoom meeting, we could post that on the project website for people to sign up for testimony to those two items.
Okay, so just to clarify and make sure I understand, we will keep the written record open for these two items only until the close of business on the 14th of April. And we will be taking testimony at that time only on these two items. Is that correct?
That was my understanding, yes.
Lindley, does that square with your legal understanding?
That was my understanding of the proposal, yes.
Good. Colleagues, any further comments on that? Okay, and then we just need to make sure we clarify the email address, Eric, where people can provide that written testimony. Do you have that URL handy?
Yeah,
for the record?
I do. So the written testimony, once I turn on I literally have to go flip a switch to turn it on again. But once I turn it on, you'll be able to submit comments at the map app on the address on the screen at the top. And then once we have a link to the registration for that particular council meeting, we will post it on the project website as well at the link at the bottom. I also want to clarify that we are continuing to work on the findings that will be necessary to document how this complies with land use goals and policies, and we will begin the work of updating those. Depending on what happens on the 14th, we will need additional time beyond that to finish those. And then also it was mentioned that the commentary in the ordinance, it refers to commentary on the in the document that expresses legislative intent. And as we provide you with an updated report that incorporates these amendments, we will also update the commentary and bring that back for your endorsement as well.
All right, very good. So excellent. I appreciate this, everybody. This gives us a little more time and focus on these particular amendments. There's a lot of focus on parks and open spaces. And so these issues about RVs and tiny houses on wheels really didn't get the attention and the focus they deserved. So I think it's entirely appropriate that we carry this over and have that opportunity for additional testimony focused on these items. And I appreciate everybody's flexibility in allowing us to do that. Is there anything else we need to do then today on this matter?
There is not from our end, Mayor.
All right, very good. Then with that, colleagues, any last comments before I adjourn us? I'm not seeing anything. So with that, colleagues, we are adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow afternoon for another council session. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
This is OPB. You can find more news online at opb.org.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Procter & Gamble, maker of Align Probiotic, a daily supplement to support digestive health, containing a probiotic strain developed by gastroenterologists with 20 years of research. More at alignprobiotics.com.
This is All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Elsa Chang in Los Angeles.
And I'm Ari Shapiro in Washington. Today we have some good news about efforts to fight the pandemic. Pfizer announced